Games surely need to be fun first, everything else later, right? Well, hold on a second. Is that always true? Typically, when we think of what fun is, we think of a kind of happy enjoyment that's had when performing an amusing or pleasurable task. Maybe not all the time, of course, but the formal definition doesn't stray far from this idea either. Now, one could argue that the definition itself may be wrong or misleading, but let's assume for a second that this is a correct assessment of the word, as we could probably debate for hours what precisely constitutes fun. Under that definition, and the idea that I think most of us probably have when we think of fun, should video games be inherently fun? Let's start by looking at gaming when it was first starting. The popular games of the first few generations include the likes of Pac-Man, Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Super Metroid, Mega Man 2, Castlevania, etc. While there may be a few exceptions to what I'm about to say, pretty much all big hits are pretty easily able to be described as being under the category of what we typically think of when we think of fun. They involve engaging gameplay that includes more immediate actions and rewards and pretty much perfectly goes along with the idea of what we define as fun. So ultimately, when looking at the first few generations of gaming, I think it's agreeable to say that they were just simply fun and largely good because of it. There may be exceptions, but the most played games were simply fun. Beyond the first few generations of gaming, things start to become a little unclear in some ways. While I think most big hits would still be looked at as primarily fun, there were some games and franchises that started to become cult hits that maybe are not so fun. A few examples of what I'm talking about are Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and Clock Tower. When you get down to it, I think one could argue that survival horror titles aren't necessarily fun. I mean, a large amount of the genre is having scares, limited ammo to manage, and being a lone character attempting to survive in a situation that makes you underpowered relative to your circumstances. Still, I will admit that those don't necessarily mean those games aren't fun. They do still provide satisfying combat and could be argued to be fun, especially in its most euphoric moments, so I won't dwell on that. There are also games outside of survival horror that start to become somewhat questionable in deciding whether there's fun to be had from it or not. More story-based games that have a lot of narrative elements, cutscenes, plot twists, and I think it's this point where you should start asking the question, even if it is fun, am I really playing it because of that, or am I playing it to get to the sequences which are noticeably less fun, but provide a kind of euphoric mental engagement that may not be inherently fun? Still, overall, I can definitely see a lot of people's answers being that it's simply fun and that's why they play it. Even so, I think by this point, fun is often superseded with the desire to get to the next bit of story. Now, we could potentially argue whether the enjoyment of watching cutscenes is fun, or watching TV is fun for a more direct comparison, but I don't really think I need to. After the PS1 and PS2 era of games, I think this is where games start to become noticeably less fun. We get more narrative-driven games with very little fun, such as Telltale's games. A large part of the point about playing Telltale's games is that the decisions you make are difficult and won't come to a clearly fun or satisfying conclusion. There are fun moments throughout, sure, but I think it's reasonable to say that's not why most people play them. Even without Telltale, there are still plenty of story-based games that very much try to immerse you into its world by showing you the tragedy and lack of fun its world is. Also, horror has been completely redone in many ways since around 2010, when Amnesia released. When you define fun, part of that is doing pleasurable or amusing tasks. Modern horror titles go against that, and they specifically have you going out of your way to go into situations that are clearly going to be the inverse of that. While I think there's an argument to be had about old survival horror games being fun, mostly in that there's a rewarding, working system of gameplay mechanics that are satisfying and rewarding, especially once you become more familiar with the games, that idea has oftentimes been stripped away in recent years for an approach that tends to strictly scare you and force you to simply not die, as opposed to more rewarding gameplay. It's not that there's no satisfaction or rewards to be had, of course, but I think it's a stretch to say that fun, in the definition we laid out earlier, is the reason to play these horror games. Even if it weren't for those titles, however, there are still plenty of titles that make sure to provide you with mundane tasks, and while they may be fun for some, I don't think that's the reason why most gamers play them. I've mentioned a lot of different games that are arguably not fun, but that still doesn't answer this question. Does it actually matter whether it's fun or not? This is an opinion piece, of course, so I personally think that it's not a bad thing and is actually a very good thing, so long as we recognize whether we like something because it's fun or not. By recognizing what we're engaged in, not necessarily what we have fun with, we recognize the reasons that we want to play a particular game, and that allows us to better articulate what makes a game good or bad, while still being subjective, of course. I think the Resident Evil franchise shows this very well, a series where immersion, scares, and deeper thought seem to take priority for the majority of the fan base over action-packed fun. Or at least, that's how I make sense of why the fan base seems to like the originals far more than at least 5 and 6. Overall, I think it's actually an awesome thing that games aren't necessarily fun. It shows that video games have genuinely evolved and matured over time, not being restricted to a specific set of genres where the only purpose is to have fun. Gaming can also be other things, such as cathartic and euphoric. If there's any general good emotion that can be applied to gaming as a whole, I don't think it's necessarily fun, but engaging, and maybe enjoyable. It may seem like semantics to many people, but I think it's important to make the distinction, because it helps us realize what we want from the games, and what we want to see in the future. It may be scary to some folks to think of gaming as not being entirely about fun, especially if that's the primary reason why you game. You could think that I, or others who don't wholly play games for fun, are in a way attacking games that are just meant to be fun, and I can certainly see why in some instances. But don't worry, that's one of the great things about a true art form. There will always be room for fun.